My name is Scott Levac. I'm the Director of Cloud Oversight and Core Technologies within the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about technology lock-in. So a bit of a disclaimer before I start. When we talk about technology lock-in, it has often a way of irking some people to the point of becoming almost emotional. I put this scene from a movie I like called Casino, where De Niro's character starts to make some people unhappy and they come after him. So hopefully that won't happen to me here. It's a good thing we're doing this virtually today. But part of the reason that talking about lock-in can be so passionate with people is because it's about decision making, and it's also going to be about challenging cognitive biases. So often when we have to make decisions, especially quick decisions, cognitive biases can creep into our decision making. And it's because our brain wants to take shortcuts and rely on what we know instead of doing a more in-depth analysis. So as I go through this, I am going to talk a little bit about some of the cognitive biases that we experience, especially around decision making and when's the right time to leave a technology or stay with a technology. An example of that is confirmation bias. So what can happen is, let's say you're given a dashboard with 10 different metrics on it. Oftentimes what will happen is we'll focus on one or two pieces of data that reinforces our preconceived notions of what's happening or what the explanation is, and ignoring the 7 or 8 other pieces of information. And so a lot of times what we have to do to overcome confirmation bias is to step back and look at all the information that's there, because the answer might be different than what we think it is on the onset. And often too, when we deal with technology lock-in, we do have to overcome our biases and maybe take a step back and rethink of how we think of lock-in. So when we talk about cloud, lock-in tends to come up a lot. And the heart of that seems to be around how the span of control changes with cloud. You think on the far left in our traditional model, and the model that we've really had for IT in the government for the last over 40, 50 years, it's one where we've bought all the base components ourselves and we've engineered them into solutions. And then we've also assessed them for compliance. So in that situation, we have a large span of control over the solution. As we start to move now to the right, our span of control becomes less and less. And if you take something like platform as a service or SaaS, lock-in gets discussed quite a bit. And if you think about something like SaaS, where you now have to move at the pace of the provider. So often in a SaaS type model, you can't opt out of changes that occur within the service. So your business and your operations are forced to move at the same pace as the provider's roadmap. Now, this can be a great advantage as you're always up to date, you're always getting the latest technology, but it can also be difficult for organizations who aren't ready to move at that pace and maybe don't want to move their business at that pace. So people start to fear lock-in, especially when you think, wow, I've become really dependent on this service. What if one day it's not there? So think of something like, I don't know, Office 365, which we've become very dependent on. We create documents in there, spreadsheets, etc. Well, what if one day that service was no longer there? What would happen to a lot of information that we've accumulated? So one of the biases that we often encounter when evaluating technology And it kind of relates back to my previous slide, is actually known as the IKEA bias. And simply put, when we build things ourselves, we tend to have we put greater value on them and greater trust in those things. So thinking back before, when I talked about our traditional model where we built everything from the ground up versus a software as a service type model, an IKEA type bias definitely comes into that model. We tend to say, hey, we feel more trust. We're more protected from lock-in when we own and operate it all ourselves and we build it ourselves. In fact, that's not always the case, because all that ownership of assets also puts a burden on us, an operational burden on us. And it makes it quite difficult for us to get out of that model because we are so invested in that model. And it also comes to another type of bias that we deal with, which is sunk cost fallacy, which is, we've invested a lot of money in a certain technology. We've put a lot of time into it. We've tooled our organizations for that technology. And so when it comes to evaluating whether we should stay or leave a technology, we often overvalue those things that we've invested a lot in. And that's not always the right decision. And from a business case point of view, you can look at the numbers, but a sunk cost fallacy is actually an emotional response where, so to speak, fudging the business case because we overvalue the investments that we've made in the past. Now, before cloud, we were always dealing with lock-in, whether it's mainframes, data centers, database platforms, ERPs. We've dealt with lock-in for a long time. And cloud doesn't fix that lock-in necessarily, but it does change some of the dynamics around it. So if there's nothing else that you remember from this presentation, I hope you take away this equation right here. And it comes from ThoughtWorks. If you've not read any of the information from ThoughtWorks, they're like a Gartner, but 100 times better. So check them out. And they come up with this simple equation for governing lock-in. And it's simply that lock-in is equal to the switching cost minus the opportunity gain. And I think what's important in here is a lot of times people talk about lock-in and focus a lot on a future switching cost. That if I invest in this thing or I switch to this technology, at some point I'm going to have to get out of that technology, and it's going to be difficult, expensive, risky, etc. But what is often lost is the opportunity gained, which can offset that switching cost. So what this equation is basically saying is, a degree of lock-in is okay as long as you get a lot of gained opportunity out of that lock-in. And a good example of that when we deal with cloud is, you have a lot of choices sometimes to bring in third-party software or to use the provider's native services, whether it's for monitoring, whether it's for configuration management, databases even. And the cloud provider native services can often provide a lot of opportunity gain because you don't have to manage them, right? You don't have to port software in, keep it up to date, patch it, configure it. In the case of a managed PaaS type service, you're getting a lot of opportunity that's gained out of that. So again, when you're thinking about lock-in, don't just focus on the switching costs that come in the future. Also look at that opportunity gained that comes from adopting a certain technology. So let's dive a little deeper into the equation. So first, let's look at the switching costs. So when we look at switching costs, it's quite difficult because we're talking about some event that's going to happen in the future. And often we tend to think far off in the future because typically we don't hop from technology to technology on a month-to-month or year-to-year basis, right? So when we look at that switching cost, what are we really talking about? Well, what we're really talking about is the cost of acquiring a new technology and retiring the old technology. But probably bigger than that is the actual migration. And when you see what comes out of a migration is often we leave behind the technology, but we want to port our business rules and our data sets to a new technology. And that can often be quite an expensive process, right? So whether data conversion might be a little bit simpler, but business rules are often encoded either in supplier provided code or in the configurations or code that we've added to the technology. The other thing that can be quite expensive is the people component around that. It's because we've tooled ourselves for a certain technology, and switching technologies means that we have to retool ourselves and reskill ourselves for that technology. So now it's hard to predict those things again because we don't know what the future looks like. And often what happens is as a technology becomes less popular and people are moving away from it, the market often responds by providing new tools and services to make the exit of that technology even easier. So again, though, it's never going to make it a zero cost. Switching costs are always going to be there. However, again, thinking back to the equation, you also have to look at the opportunity gained. So let's talk about the opportunity gained. Oh, before I talk about the opportunity gained, we should talk a bit about what causes a technology exit. So on the left, I tried to put a number of possible scenarios that may cause us to leave a technology. And what I also tried to do was look at the risk, measure the risk of that happening. And whenever we measure risk, we look at likelihood and impact, right? And so let's look at the first scenario that we often look at. And this one comes up a lot when we talk about cloud is that scary scenario that the cloud provider is suddenly going to shut its doors one day and all our data and our services and everything we rely on are no longer going to become available to us, right? And so we have to say, like, what's the actual likelihood of that scenario happening? Obviously, the impact would be extremely high in that case. But how often do you see a very viable technology company in an atomic event over the course of a few days suddenly shutter operations, right? Very, very, very low. In fact, what's more likely to happen is probably what's third on the list, which is, if they have customers, they're going to be acquired by another company. And when that happens, it can introduce security concerns, for example, especially when foreign ownership or new elements are introduced into the supply chain. So, spending a lot of time worrying about those top scenarios, why you can't necessarily dismiss them, the likelihood of those scenarios are quite low. So instead, we tend to focus more on the bottom portion of this list, which is, what if we get into a provider who has like a lack of innovation and fails to compete over time? Or let's think if we think of lack of performance or lack of competitive pricing, right? So in those cases, those are things that happen, again, not as atomic events, but over a long period of time. And the impact of those, can often be dealt with, right? We stay with providers who don't necessarily provide us the best technology or the best service, but we stay with them a lot of times for convenience, right? So we can accept the risks in those scenarios. So when we think about technology exit scenarios and we think about lock-in, we really have to look at the fact that most technology declines over time. Is not a sudden event like a fire alarm where everybody needs to rush out suddenly. It's more of a slow decay over time. And as that decay happens, we have to make the decision to possibly migrate to a new technology. So now let's look at the opportunity gain. So the first opportunity gain that happens a lot of times when we are looking at a technology is the operational burden. So in a scenario where we could take a piece of software, deploy it on VMs, and operate it ourselves, we might feel that's a lower technology lock-in scenario. However, it's also a larger operational burden for us, right? Whereas if we look at, let's say, a managed service or a platform as a service, in that case, it's providing us a lot of reduced operational burden in terms of maintenance, security, et cetera, right? So we have to look at those opportunity gains, and they're significant. We often don't address aging technology. We have tens of thousands of old Windows operating systems out there, old database systems. We're really bad at patching, but at the same time, it's hygiene of patching has become critical to the security of systems. The next opportunity gain that we get is often speed, right? So using pre-engineered services, often like what you find in the cloud or cloud native services, gives you an amazing amount of speed because they're there, they're ready to go. And when a lot of reasons we're adopting cloud is not about cost savings at all. It's about speed, that we're trying to gain agility and we're trying to deliver faster. So again, looking at things like your time to market, getting things out quicker, the opportunity gain can be speed. And the last thing I'll talk about is business value. When we adopt certain technologies, we gain a humongous business value, even though they present a lock-in. Office 365 is a good example of that, right? A lot of our COVID response or our ability to work remotely has become very dependent on Office 365. So that's a case where, obviously one day in the future, we're going to be, unhappy with a service like that because we become unhappy with all technology over time. And we're going to have to deal with the fact that we're going to have to switch to another technology. And it's going to be pricey and it's going to be disruptive. However, you have to think all that's been offset by the business value that's provided us over time. So one scenario that I often see is IT professionals become very fixated on being able to port technology as a means of protecting against lock-in. And that's fair enough. That can be a scenario, but you also have to understand too, a lot of times our driver for switching technologies or exiting technologies is because that technology is no longer providing what it should. And if you think back to the list I had provided earlier around scenarios that cause us to exit a technology, often it's no longer performant, no longer cost effective, doesn't meet business needs anymore. So one piece of advice I'd have for people is don't focus on porting the technology. Focus more on the ability to port, your business rules and your data. So if you think of something like database, and you could take a piece of software, let's say an Oracle database, deploy it on VMs, and you have control of that engine, and you're able to move that around everywhere, right? Versus taking like a database as a service where maybe it's got an open source engine, or maybe the engine is, effectively you can't control the database engine. All you're focusing on is the data schema and the data. So in that scenario, if you want to port that to, let's say, another cloud, you might have to change your database engine, which means changing your schema to a certain degree or your code or the APIs. But in that case, the opportunity gained from using a platform may offset the lock-in concerns or the switching costs that come out of that. But what you really want to focus in that case on is being able to port the technology and the data. The other thing is, a lot of times we try to apply more technology to mitigate against lock-in. And so, for example, you see a lot of these multi-cloud type platforms where they try to abstract the management of the cloud environment through software. And what you're effectively doing, though, is becoming locked into a new layer of software. Yes, it may apply to multiple cloud environments, but you're now having a very generic cloud experience, and you do gain portability, but you're becoming locked into a new software layer. And if that is software instead of a service type layer, you're now taking on additional operational burden. So, a lot of times what you think you're doing is you're strapping software on, and yes, you're getting an airplane, but which one do you really want? The one on the left or the one on the right? So applying technology to more technology to offset lock-in um, is not always the right way to go. Again, these are not universal solutions. Each scenario is a bit unique. What I'm really trying to provide are different considerations. Again, this comes from martinfowler.com, fantastic site for different technology issues. And like all decisions, when they brought to the executive level, they have to be on a 2x2 grid because no executive understands anything about technology unless it fits on a 2x2 grid. And what they're really trying to talk about here is, again, kind of goes back to that equation, the switching cost versus unique utility. Unique utility is a bit of a strange name here, but it really goes to that unique business value. And what this is trying to say is, you have to accept a certain degree of lock-in a lot of times, which means a larger switching cost, but also a greater business value. Now, obviously, in some cases, some technologies are very disposable, or some provide you, great ability to be able to exit yet high business value, fairly rare. So you can't necessarily totally avoid technology lock-in. It's more that will the switching costs in the future be offset by the opportunity that you gain through using this technology throughout its life cycle. Now, I've talked a lot about technology and cognitive biases, but going back, probably the biggest way to mitigate lock-in is you and your skills and your methods. We come from a traditional IT environment where delivery is very periodic, right? And a lot of discussion today is about moving to continuous delivery. So if you can deliver faster and pivot faster from technology, you're less locked in on technology because you have the methods and the culture to change quite quickly instead of making change periodic where technical debt accumulates over time and making change harder and harder and riskier. So that speaks to some of the methods we use, but also your skills. Keeping your skills up to date is also a great way of mitigating against lock-in because you're aware of changes in the technology domain and change doesn't scare you at that point. So you are a very important part of mitigating against lock-in. The other thing is we're faced with these decisions and our cognitive biases hold us back a lot of time. Things like status quo bias, where we overvalue the status quo and we're afraid of change. Change represents a greater risk. Now, that can be legitimate in some cases, but it can also hold us back where we're afraid to move to a new technology and we're not necessarily unlocking the business value that we want. So the Government of Canada has documented some guidance around how to evaluate technology lock-in and also exit strategies. It's on the Cloud Wiki site. I hope you'll think about checking it out. It's a fairly easy read, and it's not meant to necessarily repeat the volume of information that's already out there in the world around how to evaluate technology lock-in, but instead is probably more of a pointer to some of the items I talked about today. And it just provides a brief overview of some of the considerations in terms of evaluating technology. I think the biggest thing I want to leave people with is, don't allow your fear of technology lock-in to necessarily atrophy you and stop you from going forward to with using a technology, especially if it provides enormous business value. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't tell when a technology will become unpopular. We're all here talking today about cloud and DevOps. 20, 30 years from now, we might sit there and say, oh, that's terrible technology. Who still does that? And that's likely to happen at some point. But in the meantime, we're going to derive fantastic business value from it. And, we're going to do great things. And that's a lot of times what we have to focus on. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. Again, check out the guidance and thank you very much.